Good morning and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I am your host, Chris Whitehead, and this is the fourth episode in our series talking about environmental justice and climate change issues. For anyone who's joined us to date, we started off talking EJ, climate change, and environmental economics, all topics close to my heart. And we're continuing that trend today, talking about energy justice. We'll go through what that means in case anyone does not know. But part of the point of these podcasts is to get high quality education on these issues out there for anyone interested. So I've been extremely actually encouraged and heartened by the interest I've gotten in it. So I am very lucky today to have two good friends and colleagues on who have just been doing incredible work on these topics. The first is Abby Watson, uh, CEO and co-founder of the Groundwire Group. And welcome, Abby.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. I am very excited to participate in this after listening to your first few episodes.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And I love doing these for a lot of reasons, but when we do it right, it ends up being kind of just like the conversations we had over cold drinks in the past anyway. So it's kind of a nostalgic thing for me actually as well.
Yeah.
And then also we're lucky to be joined with Professor Raphael Heffron, who's also senior counsel at Janssen. Raphael, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, and it's great to be part of this discussion with you and Abby. And I've been following the let's say the program you have, so it looks very exciting.
I appreciate that very, very much. And I, in full honesty, I like to do a little prep work for all these episodes. So I have a couple of your past papers up on the other screens in front of me. So I'm probably going to be bouncing things off you from that. But just can you guys each start generally speaking as to how you got into the work you're currently doing, why you're doing energy justice stuff, a little bit as to what your companies or um, in case of Raphael, your last type of subject stuff you'd like to go over. Just basic introductions so we get started. And I think we'll start with Abby, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So as you said, my name is Abby Watson. I'm the president and co-founder of the Groundwire Group. We're a boutique strategy consulting firm working with organizations engaged in sustainability and climate issues. I have been in renewables for my entire career, so coming up on 20 years now that I've worked in different types of renewable energy, and now sort of more broadly in sustainability and climate. I would say I got into this work because I took an environmental science class in high school. And that was around the time that An Inconvenient Truth had come out, Al Gore's big, documentary. And I remember taking this class and being so utterly outraged by the injustice of the fact that the people who will suffer the most from climate change are the ones who have contributed least to it. And that has always, since I was a kid, I would get really fired up about, when I saw injustice of different sorts or miscarriage of justice. And so that was what really got me interested in environmental science, and decided to focus on that when I decided to start university. But the career path kind of took me in a direction that I wasn't expecting. If you had told me that I would be working on the business side of this when I was in high school, I would have told you you were crazy. I thought I was going to be a geologist working for the USGS and working on, climate geology issues and things like that. The more sort of what can we learn about climate change from the past climate aspect. But, life took me in a different direction, and I found myself working in a business environment for a company that focused on risk management. So they were owners and lenders representatives, and were just getting involved in utility scale renewables right around 2006, which is when I started working there. And I was with that company when President Obama came into office, and we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was at the time the biggest, policy action that had ever been taken in the US related to climate. And I had the opportunity to participate in a few subcommittee meetings with the American Council on Renewable Energy, which is a nonprofit based in DC that does a lot of policy work. And it was almost like being struck by lightning of having that moment where you kind of see, okay, I see now how policy is really shaping what our climate outcomes are going to be, and where there's such an important nexus with business and the commercial side of things, because for better or for worse, we live in a capitalist system, and we are relying on commercial solutions to kind of deliver the climate change responses that we need. And so that was really where I saw myself kind of taking my career, and did eventually move in that direction. It was kind of a winding path, but I spent 11 years at Siemens Gamesa, which is one of the largest wind turbine manufacturers in the industry. And for the last 5 or 6 years I was with that company, I was fortunate to be their head of government affairs. So I had the privilege of being in the room when a lot of pieces of the IRA and some of the policies that went into building the IRA were being drafted. I had left the company not long before that policy was actually passed by Congress, and also involved in a lot of their supply chain work and some of their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, both internally and looking at what they could offer to their clients in terms of how to sort of support developers with their diversity, equity, and inclusion needs for putting together project proposals. So I've had the opportunity to kind of look at all of this from a lot of different points of view. I spent a little bit of time on the offshore wind development side before launching my own consultancy. And the reason I decided to do this, and I recently merged my practice with a partner. So I now have a partner in my business who focuses on communication, and our purpose is to try to help folks solve the big things. The bigger, the hairier, the messier the problem, the more excited we are to work on it. So we're doing a lot of transmission work, which kind of makes sense.
It does make sense, actually.
Yeah, and our goal is to have as much impact as possible in terms of moving us toward a more sustainable future that's also more just. So we have now the privilege of working with a lot of different organizations that are trying to look at this from a justice lens as well.
Absolutely. And just in full disclosure, I suppose Abby and I first met in the offshore wind space and have been friends and colleagues ever since. And actually working on a couple of side projects together, touching on transmission and just the hairy, nasty stuff that Abby was kind of alluding to there. But I always kind of just actually respected her for a lot of reasons, but just because she has that passionate, objective voice on these types of issues. So again, thank you, Abby. Raphael?
Thank you. Yeah, so I suppose my interest in the area came about really because my PhD focused on looking at some of the law and policy issues around developing nuclear energy plants. And the reason to look at that, I looked at those in the US actually, as well as the EU. And part of that was to think about these are some of the most complex infrastructure projects we have. And if you can solve the challenges for them, you can probably solve the challenges for a lot of other energy infrastructure. And let's say as I began to do more work, the importance of some of these challenges of building energy, I realized was connected to the climate change issues of the energy sector being responsible for the majority of carbon dioxide. And really this approach began then to look at issues around market design, policy formulation, and really to see where justice operated in the design and formulation, and what was the impact for let's say, on different communities, different individuals, organizations, and let's say the whole community of scholars from different places all over the world made the area of energy justice more interesting, more intriguing, because let's say when I started off, you were just usually in a team of 4 or 5 lawyers discussing how we could have more justice. But today it's totally switched the other way around. So lawyers are in the minority. So, instead of 5 lawyers on a project, you just have 1 lawyer, and the rest are from other disciplines. And if you look at the published research today, probably 95% of it is driven by researchers from all other disciplines who, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have associated those disciplines with focusing on justice issues. So today you have engineers, you have political science, you have economists and environmental scientists, and they're all interested, they're all publishing on justice issues. So I think it's a huge change over the last 10 to 15 years. I should caveat it and say that I'm sure there were some who were working on justice issues, but the vast majority weren't. So to me, that's what makes it a very exciting sector. And I know that Chris, your company Worley, is also beginning to think more about issues around justice as well. And it's exciting to see, let's say, new consultancies begin to be established. As I understand it, Abby, your firm is focusing, a key part will be on justice, and I think there's so much scope. By way of introduction as well, I'm a professor in energy justice in the south of France at the University of Pau, and we have a multi-million euro research project looking at energy justice issues around the world. So we look at Europe, we look at Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the US, Canada, the Caribbean, Latin America. So we have a global team of researchers, and some of the work I've done has been in different places all over the world. I know, for example, that some of energy justice work and the methods and frameworks have been used with local communities in Colombia, for example, around developing transmission lines. So, exactly what you were talking around developing transmission systems. So I think more and more there's great scope, and I think one of the recent highlights for me, and it's kind of the reason I continue to work in this area, because I think it's getting bigger, the issues are there, and globally everyone is looking to see how we can have this just transition. And as evidence of that, you just have to look back at the last year's climate change conference, UN COP 28, and nearly the majority of countries have agreed to develop what they refer to as a just energy transition pathway. And although that's not set, it's not going to be set in law just yet. The point is, the countries all around the world are formally beginning to say, this is how we develop our society and how we ensure that we have energy and justice, developing that relationship together and into the future. And I think energy justice, we can contribute to our country's future growth and the growth of the international community on this issue. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to go into a couple of things you just touched on, but first, the concept of just transition. And I'm not gonna bore anybody in trying to define what energy justice is because I don't think that gets anywhere. But at the heart of all of this is this fundamental need to power and heat homes, to operate businesses reliably and affordably. And if we're trying to do that on a lower carbon profile, how do we ensure that the um poor, the more vulnerable can still afford it and that they're not given an undue burden on cost and still given a choice if they want one and how they power their homes. And I'm interested too, Raphael, to hear this is kind of a little bit of a tangential question, I suppose. What drivers are pushing this issue internationally? Because a lot of people just think, oh, that this is born in the United States, environmental justice is born in the United States, energy justice born in the United States, and that's not always the case. I was interested to hear more about that. So if you want to touch on the first part, first, the reliability and cost.
Yeah, so I mean, just as you said there, you're not going to bore people with the definition. Um, I I agree with that in one way because I think this is, let's say, this is a journey, and we are on this, let's say, justice journey that we have to bring everyone along, and it has to be inclusive. And my issue about reliability and cost is I don't think people are being presented with the correct options. When I see it from a view around the world, I see that people are being told, "Oh, the cost of the energy transition is very high. How can we make sure you have justice? The costs are too high." And I'm just thinking in different parts of the world, I'm going, well, actually, it's more expensive to put in gas pipelines and build gas infrastructure. I mean, how many years does it take to build a gas plant? Somewhere between 2 to 6. So let's say on average across the world, maybe 4 years. You can put up a small solar park or a couple of wind turbines in an area. You can do that in, let's say, 2 to 6 months, and people have some energy. So the the options today are about are cheaper today to give people access to energy. And I think the debate needs to change because, yes, some communities they already have energy supply, but I mean, we're talking about a journey that we need to start saying to communities, actually that fossil fuel plant that should be closed down. It has reached the end of its life, and that's why it's more inefficient and unreliable. And you should be given a new source of energy, which can be built. The timeline for building these is much shorter, and we should be thinking about reliability will come in the shape of greater innovation on battery technology. And I know that in US policy currently there is a major drive to try and push innovation in battery technology, look at the supply chains of where the different materials come from. And to me, I think we need more of that so that we can support reliability in the grid system. We can ensure that vulnerable customers still have full access to electricity. But to go back to my original message, I think we need to end the debate that this cost of transition and justice is prohibitive, because in 5 or 10 years we face a choice in many places. We do need new energy infrastructure in America, for example. A lot of it is getting old. So the choice is, do you give clean energy, or do you go along with the myth that dirty energy or fossil fuel is still an option? And my view would be, you can give people clean energy in, let's say, 6 to 12 months easily. You have to wait for 4 years at least before you can give them fossil fuels. So the choice, the cost is lower. And as a final point, I will say just some recent research out from in the top journal in the world, Nature. It showed that I think it was this year or last year was the first year that the insurance costs of tackling the climate change problems are higher than what we spent trying to build, clean energy. And I think, clearly we need to be thinking of the messages going to society on this energy choice or consumer choice in energy. They need to be changed for me.
Absolutely. And that's a point that keeps coming up a lot as I do these podcasts, the costs of insurance, the fact that they're only going up. And Abby, I wonder if you could jump in on this conversation too, especially as it relates in the United States to the fact that coal and fossil fuel sources have been a historically very, very high percentage and reliable percentage of our electric grid. But if you look into it, they don't price in environmental and public health impacts. So what do we do about that? And do you agree with Professor Heffron that converting over to renewables is something that we can do relatively fast?
Ooh, I have so much to say about this set of questions, and I'm really pleased to have Raphael in this discussion because I think we have very different conversations and drivers for some of these issues in the US than, in other parts of the world. Certainly a very different conversation than you would have in the developing world about what does it mean to have energy justice and, low cost, and, who are we in the developed, wealthy Western world to tell developing nations that they can't develop their economies in the same way we did. So I mean, and that's kind of a whole different conversation to unpack, but just to bring in some of my personal perspective. So I grew up in rural Maine, and I grew up, my dad's farm is on a dirt road, off of a dirt road, about 40 miles from the nearest hospital. So, it's quite rural. The infrastructure is really fragile. And power outages were always a fact of life when I was growing up. And this is extremely common in most of rural America and even, other parts of the country that are less rural, where, we would frequently have power out for multiple days at a time, if not a week or longer, if there was a really bad ice storm and, a lot of customers were affected. So when we talk about electrifying everything in parts of the country like that, it's a really hard conversation to have, especially when you're telling folks, we want you to change to electric vehicles, we want you to electrify everything in your home, and they say, well, what happens when my power goes out for a week at a time, like it happens twice a year? And so it's challenging to have a one size fits all question about that, leaving aside the clear long-term environmental benefits. People have near-term immediate needs, and in some ways this can be a matter of life and death in places like rural Maine, where you need your vehicle to be able to get to work and to drive yourself to the hospital. If an emergency happens, you can't wait for an ambulance to come get you. They say in some of these hospitals, if the farmer shows up, then something's really wrong. Get him into a room ASAP. So, I think the other, set of issues that we have to cope with there in terms of the affordability of the energy transition, and how people can access it. Again, thinking about rural Maine and other parts of the country where the population is aging. If you are in your 70s and you're looking at potentially putting solar panels on your house, well, you might not see that return on investment. So, there may be a different set of, incentives or tools that we need to help some of those homes become more energy self-sufficient, where they're looking at maybe aging out of their homes, and needing a lot of other upgrades. In other communities where folks are low income, again, if you're thinking about solar panels or installing a battery backup, they're capital intensive projects. First, you need to own your home, which in a lot of low income communities is not the case. Many folks are renting. And then even if you do own your home, you typically need to be able to get a loan in order to install some of that equipment. And so then you're coping with issues of credit. Are you going to be approved for that loan? And so many of our incentives in the US for homeowners to do things like install solar panels are tax credit based. You only get the incentive once you make the investment, so a lot of these incentives are structured in a way that middle and upper class Americans are much better positioned to capture them and maximize them. So it's a different set of questions, and then when we think about cost, the question of cost makes me crazy sometimes, because I will try to avoid going on my rant about this, but it's about whose costs and which costs are you counting here? And the reality is that American consumers largely have become very accustomed to having low cost of energy, and in the process of subsidizing that energy by not including the cost of carbon for many, many decades, a small handful of individuals, executives, shareholders have gotten very wealthy on the dividends of fossil fuel companies, and then the same group of people say, well, you want us to transition our business, and boy, that's going to be awfully expensive, and we're going to have to pass these costs on to the consumers. Please, could we get some subsidies and incentives to help offset those costs? And it's like, well, wait a minute. You all became fabulously wealthy doing this by avoiding paying for the damage that you knew very well that you have been causing for decades. And now you're saying that to clean up your act, you need more taxpayer money, and people are going to have to pay more for the new product. So there are some really fundamental justice issues just in the way that we have constructed our energy costs. And, people don't like to have a conversation about putting a cost on carbon in the US, but I actually do see us slowly and incrementally moving toward a place where that question has a lot more viability, because it's probably the only way to do this energy transition in a way with any degree of justice. When you are putting the entire cost of the energy transition onto ratepayers, it's a very regressive way to do that. Everybody's paying the same electricity rates, and low-income people are least able to reduce their energy consumption because, again, many of them don't own their homes. They can't access some of the subsidies, and if you were able to transfer more of the cost of the investment needed for the energy transition onto taxpayers, or increasing tax receipts from highly emitting individuals and businesses and using that to help pay for the transition, well, that would be a much more equitable way to do that. So I get a little fired up about the cost piece, because it's really a question of redistribution.
It is. And I always enjoy, frankly, when you get on your soapbox, so that's totally fine. But just to touch on a couple of things you just said, the carbon tax or options for it are one aspect of this, and we dig into that in the third episode with Ken Richards. But carbon taxes don't touch on co-pollutants, don't touch on particulate matter, local health impacts, stuff that the EPA has just started to actually address very, very recently. And I think in the last couple of days, in fact, in power plant rules. But you'll hear from various interests in the United States, oh, again, if we do this, the reliability is going to be a huge issue. It's not there yet. It's not ready yet. It's it's putting too high a burden on us. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but is it viable to transition over now to the alternative energy sources? And if it's not just offshore wind, it's not just solar. In my opinion, it has to be a combination. in any geography based on that geography. But what types of bottlenecks or supply chain issues are out there, and how are those being addressed right now?
Well, I would say if you don't mind me kind of jumping in on that one, this is, I would say, the majority of the focus of my consultancy practice. We use systems thinking as a tool to help folks map out, what those bottlenecks look like and where some of the leverage points might be. We need a diversity of resources. I completely agree. And you will see a lot of techno-economic analyses. Oh, well, if we just install crazy amounts of solar and storage, that will solve all the problems, and there are two issues with that. One is just a land use question. And two is that there are supply constraints on both of those sets of materials, and you will quickly see your cost advantage evaporate if the demand outstrips supply. That's just, fundamental basic economics. So having a diversity of resources is essential. And in order to do that, you need more transmission. And to me, transmission is the number one fundamental bottleneck. Chris knows, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about transmission and what's holding it back. But Raphael kind of made mention of this, of how underinvested it's been. I mean, in the US, if you drive over our roads and bridges every day, the poor, sorry state of that infrastructure is perfectly reflected in the state of our transmission infrastructure. We have just systematically underinvested in it for 70 years. We need to do a lot of investment in the existing grid. And according to a lot of different studies, we may need to build twice as much grid as we have today in order to integrate all of the renewables. Now, we're looking at long time horizons there, and the things holding back building transmission are complicated. It's a very fragmented environment from a siting and permitting standpoint, how these things get paid for. The US is extremely balkanized in terms of how the grid is managed, built, operated. So will we build twice as much grid? Or will we find other solutions that don't require quite as much grid? I think that's really what it's going to come down to. How do you overcome some of the friction points? I think we do need to build a lot more grid. And to me, that is the number one bottleneck in the US. And, you could probably do a whole episode. I would suggest you get Ari Pesco on to talk about his paper about how investor-owned utilities have perfected the art of regulatory capture in the United States. And that is why we are not building enough transmission.
Interesting. I'm writing that down.
It's an excellent paper. You're going to like this one, Chris.
I will. But following off that, actually, Raphael, do you have anything to chime in on the international perspective? And are a lot of these same issues reflected in other countries you might work in, and then of course in France?
Well, let's say internationally, this would be a very big problem. It is let's say it, in many countries, it's a problem, I suppose, similar to the US, that push for privatization into the energy sector has left a investment deficit. And in some countries where that hasn't happened, it's because, there hasn't been the same push for privatization. They've been developing the grid more slowly, more surely. They've been trying to adapt it for renewables. That has been maybe a focus in the EU, where they have been trying to develop more cross-border electricity projects, and they have tried to reduce the permitting time and tried to offer various sorts of incentives to get some of that infrastructure built. But saying that, even if you're building the cross-border transmission internally in many countries in the EU, the transmission system is still it's a source of underinvestment. And my view would be, from looking at a range of company performance, you see that many companies are making very healthy profits. And the view is that let's call them these new entrants into the electricity market, that they should bear the cost of connecting to the grid, and they should pay, a certain charge. And this is not reflected on the existing companies in many cases. And it sort of leads to a situation where you end up, the existing companies in the market end up with the greater chance of diversifying into clean energy. And it's nearly by default. It wasn't initially a corporate strategy of theirs, but it becomes a corporate strategy by default. You can imagine the executive sitting in the room and acting surprised that suddenly they have another possible strategy, solely because the legal system, the legal architecture is set up to favor them. And I think I would describe maybe to go one step further than thinking about the bottleneck. The bottleneck for me is around finance, that the finances is locked up in this old style legal architecture that suits the current companies. And what we need to try and do is maybe release some of the valves in this energy system, where we begin to think about that point of distributive justice, where we say, why is it that some companies are earning what economists would describe as supernormal profits, and other companies are struggling to get access to the market? And these companies, as you've pointed out, they are creating, they are reducing the environmental impact of the energy sector. They are reducing the impact on public health. They are bringing better jobs, more decent jobs. And what we should be thinking about is there any way we can have some type of legacy tax on the current incumbents, because they have enjoyed the electricity grid and the whole transmission system for 30, 40, 50 years. And they should have been paying something already, but it's never too late to start. Maybe we could try and charge some type of legacy tax. And I think it feeds into just a point around siting and permitting. The question is, why do we have so much public opposition for even clean energy projects today, or even transmission, which is delivering a good service? And I would say the reason we have it is because of the bad behavior of fossil fuel companies. So there's such a level of distrust that any type of energy activity, automatically they think it's negative. And that means, as a clean energy company, you have to spend twice as much or 3 times as much money trying to get a public approval as you should have. And the comparison you can make there is, if you go to developing countries where they didn't have the behavior of some of these fossil fuel companies in their area, it's much easier to get public approval because they don't have that level of distrust of the energy company. And again, that feeds into it's a legacy behavioral issue, and that is costing the clean energy sector more money. And my view would be some type of legacy tax could pay for not just the grid updates that should have been done over the last 30, 40 years, but it could also pay for re-education around, what the benefits of clean energy, and, how to restore the environment from the environmental impacts of some of these earlier, let's say, energy companies.
There's a lot there. And I'm jumping real fast, Abby. And Abby knows stakeholder engagement work has gotten kind of near and dear to my heart over the last couple of years, because it's the crux of a lot of environmental justice and climate justice stuff in the United States. I'll just say quickly that historically our engagement models have just been broken. They've been tied to public engagement, public hearings, 2 minutes to talk, only when permits come around, and that type of thing. This absolutely breeds distrust and the types of issues you were just talking about, Raphael. I know Abby wants to jump in on this too, but I just wanted to toss it out there. Can the type of legacy tax you're referring to be tied into a loss and damages fund that was just proposed by the COP? I just say I am a little skeptical of the potential of that just because international environmental economic commitments have never been met. But before we get into that, I know Abby wants to jump in.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I can kind of address that a little bit too, but I think there's an it's complicated because there's another incumbent advantage that is particularly relevant in the US that impacts permitting as well as how we might think about these kinds of legacy taxes. We would be remiss to have this conversation without mentioning Justice 40, which is a Biden administration initiative that 40% of all investment in climate related activities should be directed towards disadvantaged communities. And Chris kind of touched on this. The reason why in the US there has been so much development of polluting infrastructure near low income and minority communities as opposed to wealthy communities is because of the power of homeowners and wealthier homeowners in particular to protect their incumbent advantage. And it is in many ways the same source of a lot of the challenges we have with the housing affordability crisis and not being able to build enough housing because incumbent homeowners want to protect their home values. They don't want to see more, supply come into the market that will damage their home values. And for most middle class Americans, that's their biggest investment, and in the US, a lot of our investment, a lot of our retirement future is tied to either an investment in our home and or investments in the stock market. And so, when we talk about, appropriating profits from some of these large companies or, implementing legacy taxes and things like that, anything that could cause the stock market to drop is like a complete boogeyman for anyone in the US whose retirement is tied up in that system, so we have this like really tricky gray area where for a majority of Americans who even have a retirement, which only about half of Americans are invested in the stock market in any way. So a lot of Americans do not have a retirement outside of Social Security, and many don't own their own homes. That becomes this fear element that it makes it easy to kind of activate people against some of these types of policies. And a concern I have about, an unintended impact of Justice 40, where we're trying to direct more of this investment toward disadvantaged communities, is are we going to repeat the same pattern of the past because those communities are generally not as equipped to engage in a lot of our public processes about permitting. There are, hearings in the middle of a workday, and it's for many of the same reasons that you see lower voting participation among some of those communities is because they just don't have the same degree of access or, understanding of really the power that they have within that system. So I think there's a lot of capacity building that we need to look at, but also thinking about the unintended consequences and who will be harmed by some of the potential solutions. And, if it's going to harm a majority of the middle class, your solution is probably not going to be very durable. So how can we kind of tailor some solutions to really be more targeted at the ultra wealthy, the folks who can spare a couple billion because who really needs a couple $1 billion as an individual, So that's where I think, it's complicated. And in the US, we have a different set of issues because we have a different system for retirement. We have a different system for how we approve and permit projects. It's a lot more granular and a lot more kind of laissez-faire. So, we have different shades of nuance here, I think.
I would agree with that. And one of the things I like to stress in my work and talking to various clients is the importance of starting the conversation with a social baseline, just so you know objectively what the impacts of your projects are going to be, and then just being forthcoming with people about potential timelines. None of this stuff happens overnight. I'm wondering, I know we're starting to come up on the end of the time here a little bit, but a couple last questions for both of you. There are obviously a lot of challenges out there in this space, as we've been discussing. Is there one thing on the horizon that kind of gives you guys hope, like, okay, this is coming, or this could be coming in a couple of years, could have a big, big impact? And whoever wants to go first is fine with me.
Um, yeah, I could uh, I I could go first. Let's say there are two issues I will talk quickly about, but I just thought maybe in response to something Abby said, I'd be interested to hear back her thoughts as well. That I do realize that question of if you affect people's future investment, but what I would say is if we look at some of the future trends, some of these companies people are invested in are predicted to lose a lot of value. And there are some international reports available that show the direction maybe of some of these fossil fuel companies where they will lose a lot of their wealth. So I wonder is if we don't tell people now, some of their pension is already under threat if they don't act. And maybe that argument becomes even more, let's say, nuanced. A second thing is for me is I believe my hope would be in the power of let's say innovators and engineers, and I would hope that solar and wind becomes so cheap that it becomes something that is easily distributable across the world, and it makes an impact. I do realize we do need some large energy infrastructure for to supply industry, but at least for ensuring people have affordable access and reliable access, that humans can develop this technology. And I'm always encouraged when we think of the technology we have developed already, like the computers we use today from what we used 15 years ago, the mobile phones we used 15 years ago, and even the fact that we can be having this conversation in video, from different parts of the world, or different places, let's say. So I would hope that we can see some of the same type of technological revolution in clean energy that we see in other tech spaces.
I think I would, so I agree that the availability of the right technology gives me hope. I think we have the technologies today broadly that we need. Of course, there will be more innovation. To me, the problems facing the energy transition are not technology problems, they're people problems. And people and the power of people to change systems is where I put my hope. The kids are giving me a lot of hope these days in their protest movements. And, I think that there is a younger generation finding their voice and an outlet for their absolutely righteous rage about all of this, because at the end of the day, we have the technology. It's about deploying it, and deployment is about financial systems, legal systems, political systems, and those are all made up by people. They are not ineffable laws of science. They are not about physics. They are about human structures and choices. And it is going to take a different set of human structures and choices to get us where we need to go. And I think that we are getting closer to really understanding how do we motivate people to do that. And that's something I spent a lot of time studying and researching, is just the, sort of the neuropsychology and biological elements of how we talk about this and how you motivate people to action. Because for me, it's the future is really about people. And that's what gives me hope.
I absolutely agree with that. But as we wrap up here pretty soon. One of the last things I wanted to ask, Raphael, because you actually instruct on these issues every day, are there a couple questions you hear most often from your class? What are they most interested about on these topics?
I would say, let's say one of the questions they would say is how do policymakers think of energy justice, and are policymakers using this terminology? Maybe a second question is sort of how does something like energy justice affect the individual? And I think they are thinking about that in a very broad way today. Let's say, each year they think about it more broadly. And maybe a third issue is what are companies doing about energy justice, and maybe why are they so slow to respond to such an initiative? And I think over the next few years, that's what will make research on the US very interesting, because we'll be able to see how companies have responded to the Justice 40 initiative. So I think it'll be a rich ground of, let's say, evidence-based research.
Absolutely. Then one final one that I always like to end on. Again, this podcast was intended to increase the quality and quantity of education out there on these issues that's available to anybody. Abby and Raphael, do you have any recommendations for good resources to look towards if anyone listening today wants to learn more?
I was prepared for this question because I've listened to your first few episodes, so I wrote out a list. And Chris, I can send them to you for the show notes afterwards. But I love podcasts. I'm a huge podcast listener. I have a lengthy list in my library, but four that I think are especially relevant on the topic of energy justice, where they have a lot of great conversations, are Climate One, The Climate Pod, Volts, and The Big Switch. Those are four that tend to focus on this topic a lot. And my ultimate favorite free resource is the library. And a couple of books that I love to recommend to people that are kind of related to this topic. One is The Magic of Dialogue by Daniel Yankelovich, which is a classic published a long time ago about how to engage in real dialogue with people and kind of bridge different points of view. A new one is called Minding the Climate by Dr. Anne-Christine Duham, about the sort of neurobiology aspect of climate communications. A new one I haven't read yet that I'm excited about, it's gotten a lot of buzz, is The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet by Brett Christophers. Another hot topic, How Big Things Get Done by Bent Flyvbjerg. And because I use a lot of systems thinking in my work, two systems thinking resources that I always recommend to folks are Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows and Systems Thinking for Social Change by David Peter Stroh.
I had no doubt, by the way, that you would have a list prepared. So thank you. Raphael?
Yeah, my tip would be to look at it's a database called ScienceDirect.com, and I think you can search around in that database. There's a lot of energy justice research, and although some of the articles are not available for free, I think it gives you the lead author's contact details. And I would always tell people, just send the lead author an email. I think most of them are only too willing to share the research. But I think if you want to first dip into the research on energy justice, that's a great place to start. Each article will have today they will have a whole reference list that is hyperlinked, so you can even explore where that research is. So it's a great place where to start. And I would also advocate listening to, as Abby said, different podcasts and everything. So that would be my tip for research.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both very, very much. It's been a fun chat. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And again, I encourage everyone to follow us on all podcast platforms and LinkedIn. We're available on Spotify and many others. And actually, next episode, I'll be joined by Jeremy Orr from Earth Justice and Sean Moriarty from Archer Public Affairs. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much and everyone have a nice day.